The ballroom at the Ashford Hotel was lit gold, chandeliers throwing soft light over 300 people in evening wear, and Travis Monroe stood at the edge of it all in a rented suit that didn't quite fit through the shoulders, holding a glass of sparkling water he hadn't asked for, watching Natalie Brooks laugh at something a silver-haired donor had said. A woman in emerald silk leaned toward another guest and said, not quietly enough, "I didn't know Natalie was seeing anyone. He seemed so normal." And the man beside her chuckled and said something about opposites attracting, and Travis felt the words land on him like a hand on his shoulder from behind, and he turned, ready to correct them, ready to say the sentence he'd rehearsed in the car. "I'm not her date. I just fixed her daughters." But Natalie's hand found his arm first, light, certain, and she smiled at the couple and said nothing at all. She let them believe it. Travis stood very still, the glass sweating in his hand, and somewhere across the room a photographer's flash caught them both mid-turn, her hand on his sleeve. His face caught in the half-second before confusion became something else. To find out how a maintenance contractor and one of the city's most guarded executives ended up standing in that ballroom, letting 300 strangers believe they were in love, stay until the very end. 11 months earlier, none of this existed. Travis Monroe was 41 years old, and his life fit inside a small rented house on Alder Street, a truck with 200,000 miles on it, and a 9-year-old daughter named Chloe who was, by every measure that mattered to him, the only real accomplishment of his adult life. He ran a small residential and light commercial maintenance business, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, the kind of quiet expertise that kept other people's lives from falling apart without anyone ever learning his name. Before that, in a version of his life he rarely spoke of, he'd been a field service engineer for an industrial firm, the kind of job with a title and a parking spot, until a divorce and a custody fight had taken most of what he had, and left him needing work that let him pick his daughter up from school every day without asking permission. He hadn't rebuilt the ladder. He hadn't wanted to. What he wanted was to be present, unmissable, in the one life that was actually his to shape. Natalie Brooks, 38, ran Halver's Analytics, a data and logistics firm her father had built, and she had quietly saved from collapse twice in 6 years, once during a merger that nearly gutted it, and once during a lawsuit that nearly did worse. She had a corner office on the 19th floor, a board that respected her the way boards respect anyone who is useful, and a daughter, Ruthie, 7 years old, who had lost her father, Natalie's husband, to a heart condition 3 years earlier, and who Natalie was, by her own private admission, raising mostly on instinct and momentum. Natalie did not date. She did not attend events she wasn't required to attend. She had built, deliberately, a life with very few soft edges, because soft edges were where people found ways to hurt you, and she had already been hurt in the one place she couldn't afford to be. The two of them had no reason to ever meet. Travis worked in the residential neighborhoods on the east side of the city. Natalie lived in a gated community on a hill that Travis had driven past 100 times without ever turning in. What brought them together was not planned by anyone, and it happened on an ordinary Tuesday in early autumn. At a community pool where Chloe had her weekly swim lesson and where, 3 lanes over, Ruthie Brooks was having what looked, for one horrifying stretch of seconds, like a seizure, her small body rigid at the pool's edge, her lips going pale, a lifeguard frozen mid-shout for help that was still 90 seconds away. Travis was closer. Travis had, in his old engineering life, sat through more emergency first response certifications than he could count, because the plants he'd worked in required it, and something in him that had been dormant for years came alive instantly and without ceremony. He was in the water before he'd decided to be. He got Ruthie onto the deck, turned her, cleared her airway, kept his voice low and steady the entire time. "You're okay. I've got you. Stay with me." While a woman he did not yet know was running across the deck in bare feet, having kicked off her heels somewhere near the entrance, screaming her daughter's name in a voice that had nothing executive left in it at all. That was Natalie Brooks's introduction to Travis Monroe. Not a boardroom, not a business card, but the sight of a stranger's hands doing, calmly and correctly, the exact thing that saved her daughter's life, while she herself could do nothing but watch and pray, and eventually kneel on wet concrete beside him, gripping Ruthie's hand so hard her knuckles went white. The ambulance came. Ruthie was fine, A febrile seizure, frightening but not rare, the doctor said. Nothing that would recur if they were careful. And by the time the adrenaline drained out of both adults, standing together in a fluorescent-lit hospital hallway at 9 at night, something had already shifted, small and unspoken, between them. Natalie asked Travis's name, he told her. She asked what he did. He said maintenance work, and watched her recalibrate something behind her eyes, the way people always did, sorting him into a category. She thanked him 4 separate times before he left that night, and each time her voice cracked slightly differently. And Travis, driving home with Chloe asleep in the back seat of the truck. She'd stayed at a neighbor's during the emergency, and he'd picked her up on the way. Thought that would be the end of it. A stranger helps a stranger. Gratitude gets said. Life moves on. It did not move on. 3 days later, a handwritten note arrived at his shop, on heavy cream stationery, thanking him again and asking, almost shyly for a woman who ran meetings with senators, whether he'd be willing to look at a dripping pipe under her kitchen sink. She'd normally call a service, she wrote, but she found she trusted him already, which was, she added, a strange thing to write to someone she'd known for 11 minutes before a crisis. Travis went. The pipe took 20 minutes to fix. He stayed 40 more, because Ruthie had wanted to show him a drawing she'd made of the man from the pool, and because Natalie had made coffee neither of them really wanted, just to have a reason to keep talking a little longer. Neither of them called it anything. Neither of them let themselves. But over the following weeks, small errands became small visits. Small visits became recurring ones, and somewhere in there, without either adult quite noticing the shift, Chloe and Ruthie stopped being incidental to the arrangement, and started being the reason it kept happening at all. 2 girls, close enough in age, who had each in their own way lost something, a mother who'd left, a father who'd died, found in each other an easy, uncomplicated friendship that neither Travis nor Natalie had the heart to interrupt. It was Ruthie, in the end, who forced the next step. The Halvorson Analytics Foundation Gala was 6 weeks away, the single largest fundraising night of Natalie's year, the event that kept the company's community programs funded, the event her late husband used to stand beside her for. And Ruthie, with the blunt logic only a 7-year-old possesses, informed her mother over dinner that Travis should come, because Chloe should come, because they were basically family now, weren't they? Natalie opened her mouth to correct her daughter and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she didn't actually want to. She called Travis that night. She did not frame it as a date. She framed it, carefully, as a favor. She needed an escort who wouldn't try to talk business with every donor in the room, she said, half joking, and he was, undeniably, someone she trusted. Travis said yes before he'd fully thought through what saying yes would mean, the way people often say yes to things they want, for reasons they haven't examined yet. Neither of them anticipated the whispers that would start the moment they walked in together. Neither of them anticipated that Natalie, faced with the choice to correct a room full of assumptions or let them stand, would choose, in that one unguarded second, to let them stand. 8 months would pass before either of them said out loud what that choice had actually meant. The morning after the gala, Travis woke early, the way he always did, and lay in the gray half-light of his bedroom, turning the previous night over in his mind like a stone he couldn't put down. He had gone to that ballroom intending to correct the first person who mistook them for a couple, and instead he had stood there, silent, letting Natalie Brooks's hand rest on his arm while 300 of the city's wealthiest and most connected people quietly filed him into a category he had no evidence he belonged in. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself Natalie had simply been managing optics, the way executives managed everything, and that he had been a convenient prop for an evening, nothing more. He believed almost none of it, and that was the problem. The trouble started 2 days later, when a photo from the gala, Natalie's hand on his sleeve, his face turned toward hers, surfaced on a local business gossip page under a headline that asked, in the breathless tone such pages specialize in, whether Halvorson's CEO had found love with a mystery man outside her usual circles. The post didn't name him. It didn't need to. Within a day, someone at his daughter's school had connected the dots, and within 2, a Halvorson board member named Preston Ames, a silver-templed man who had spent 6 years quietly resenting how much authority Natalie's father had left in his daughter's hands rather than the executive committee's, had made a call to Natalie's office requesting, with theatrical concern, a private conversation about optics and the perception of impropriety regarding vendors and community relationships. Travis had done no vendor work for Halverson. That was not, Ames made clear in the meeting. Natalie later described to him almost word for word the point. The point was a narrative, a young widow CEO, an unvetted man from a modest background, a company that had weathered enough instability without adding a tabloid subplot to it. Ames didn't say gold digger, he didn't have to. The shape of the accusation sat in the room anyway, ugly and unmistakable, and Natalie had defended Travis with a coldness in her voice that surprised even her, and had walked out of that meeting angrier than she'd been in years. Not at Ames alone, but at the fact that a man who had saved her daughter's life could be reduced, in one boardroom, to a liability. She did not tell Travis about the meeting right away. That was her first mistake, and she would come to see it as one. What Travis experienced in the days that followed was simpler and worse. A sudden coolness from a mother at Chloe's school who had once been friendly. A comment from a neighbor about moving up in the world. A moment at the hardware store where the clerk, a man Travis had known for a decade, made an offhand joke about marrying rich that landed like a slap. None of it was said with real cruelty. All of it stripped something from him anyway. The sense, hard-won and carefully protected since his divorce, that he was a man who stood entirely on his own competence and nobody's charity. He had built his whole rebuilt life on that foundation. Now strangers were rewriting his story into one where he'd been carried. He drove to Natalie's house that Thursday evening with Chloe at a friend's, intending to end the arrangement cleanly, before it cost either of them more than it already had. Natalie met him at the door already knowing, from his face, what he'd come to say. She let him say most of it, that he was grateful, that none of this was her fault, that he couldn't keep being mistaken for something he wasn't, while people quietly decided what kind of man that made him. And when he finished, she told him, evenly, about Ames, about the meeting, about the fact that she had defended him without hesitation and would do it again, and that if anyone in her life was being reduced to a convenient fiction, it was being done to both of them, not just to him. It didn't fix anything that night. Travis left anyway, and told her, gently but plainly, that he thought it was better if the girls' French continued, but the rest of it, the gala, the assumptions, whatever had been quietly building between the two of them, should stop before it became something either of them had to defend to the whole world. Natalie did not argue with him in the doorway. She had learned, over 3 years of running a company through crises, that some retreats can't be stopped with words in the moment. They have to be respected until the person doing the retreating finds their own way back. She said only that she understood, and that Ruthie would be sad, and that she hoped Chloe wouldn't be the one who paid for 2 adults being careful. Travis drove home that night with his jaw tight, and his hands too firm on the wheel, and for the first time since the swimming pool, he let himself admit, in the privacy of his own truck, exactly how much he had wanted the other version of that evening to be true. For 6 weeks after that, the two households moved in careful, deliberate parallel. The girls still saw each other, at Natalie's insistence, ferried by a driver or by Travis himself in brief, polite exchanges at the door that neither adult let go on a second longer than necessary. Travis buried himself in work, took on more jobs than he needed, told himself the ache he felt most evenings was just the cost of doing the responsible thing. Natalie, for her part, sat through board meetings where Preston Ames watched her with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he successfully contained a threat and said nothing and gave him nothing, and went home each night to an empty half of a large house and found herself, against every instinct she'd spent years cultivating, missing the sound of a man who barely spoke, standing in her kitchen fixing something that didn't need fixing anymore. So many people who've ever been quietly underestimated, written off as not belonging somewhere, not fitting the picture others had already decided on, know exactly what that 6 weeks felt like for Travis. The particular loneliness of being made small by assumptions you never agreed to. Whether he should have corrected the room the very first night, before anything had a chance to take root, or whether some things are only worth protecting once you already know what they're worth losing, is the kind of question this story doesn't answer easily. And it wouldn't, for either of them, for months yet. 8 months would pass before either of them found the courage to ask, plainly, what they actually wanted, and by the time they did, the answer would already be threatened by something neither of them had seen coming. The crack, when it came, did not come from Natalie's boardroom or from Travis's neighborhood. It came from her daughter. It was late November, 4 months into the careful distance, when Ruthie Brooks stopped eating breakfast one Tuesday morning and asked her mother, without warning or preamble, why Travis didn't love them anymore. Natalie, mid-sentence about the school bus schedule, went completely still. She tried to explain, in the careful, age-softened language adults used to protect children from truths too large for them, that grown-up things were complicated, that Travis still cared about both of them, that nothing had really changed. Ruthie, 7 years old and entirely unconvinced, said only that it didn't feel like nothing had changed, and went back to not eating her breakfast. And Natalie sat at her own kitchen table and felt something in her chest give way that she had been holding rigid for months. She began, after that morning, to notice things she'd been too disciplined to notice before. She noticed that she still reached, out of habit, for her phone to text Travis about small things. A good sale on the parts he'd once mentioned needing, a joke Ruthie had made that Chloe would appreciate, before remembering, each time, that this particular habit no longer had anywhere to go. She noticed that Preston Ames's caution about optics had never once been echoed by a single donor, employee, or actual stakeholder in the company. It had come from exactly one man, with exactly one motive, and she had let that one man's manufactured concern cost her something real. She began quietly to ask around, not investigating, exactly, but no longer avoiding the truth either, and what she found clarified things considerably. Her assistant, Marisol Vega, who had watched the entire situation unfold from just outside Natalie's office for months, and had bitten her tongue out of professional caution, finally told her plainly one evening, while they were closing out a budget review, that Ames had been maneuvering for more board control since before Natalie's husband died, that the optics concern had been raised by no one else, and that everyone in the building who'd actually met Travis at the holiday party the previous year, in passing at pickup, had liked him instantly and thought Natalie seemed, for the first time in 3 years, genuinely lighter around him. "You didn't lose your husband and rebuild this whole company," Marisol told her, "to let Preston Ames decide who you're allowed to be happy with." Natalie did not go to Travis immediately. Pride, and the specific caution of a woman who has learned the hard way what it costs to be wrong in public, held her back a little longer. But the following week brought its own complication, the kind that made further delay impossible. Preston Ames, sensing an opportunity to consolidate influence ahead of a contentious contract renewal, leaked a distorted version of the gala story to a business journalist, not naming Travis, but framing Natalie's judgment as compromised, suggesting the board should consider additional oversight on her decision-making given her personal distractions. It was a calculated strike, timed to a week when Halvorson's largest client was deciding whether to renew a contract worth $11 million, and it put Natalie in the position of having to publicly account, in front of her own board, for a relationship she had never actually clarified to herself, let alone to anyone else. She called an emergency session. She stood in front of 8 board members, Ames among them, wearing an expression of practiced concern, and instead of retreating into the careful, sanitized language she might have used a year earlier, she told them the truth, plainly. That Travis Monroe had saved her daughter's life, that their families had grown close in the months since, that she had let people believe what they believed at the gala, because, for one evening, she had wanted it to be true, and hadn't had the courage to examine why, and that none of it, had any bearing whatsoever on her judgment as CEO, a judgment that had grown this company through 2 crises Ames himself had voted to abandon. She watched Ames's composure slip, just slightly, when 2 other board members nodded along with her instead of him. She watched, for the first time in months, the shape of the whole manufactured concern reveal itself for what it actually was. Not caution, but leverage. That night, Natalie drove to Alder Street, for the first time uninvited. Travis opened the door in a paint-stained shirt, mid-repair on his own porch railing, and the sight of her standing there, unannounced, in the cold, said more than either of them managed to put into words for the first several minutes. She told him about Ames. She told him about the board meeting, about what she'd said, about Ruthie's question over the breakfast she hadn't eaten. She told him, finally, the thing she hadn't let herself say even in her own head for 4 months. That pulling away from him had not made her life simpler, only quieter, and that she had mistaken quiet for peace, and it wasn't the same thing at all. Travis listened the way he listened to everything, without interrupting, without performing understanding, just genuinely absorbing it. And when she finished, he told her the truth he'd been protecting his daughter and himself with for years. That he had gone quiet after his divorce not because he didn't have things to say, but because saying the wrong thing once had cost him nearly everything that mattered, and he had decided, somewhere in the aftermath, that the safest version of himself was the one who said as little as possible and simply showed up, reliably, for the people who needed him. It had worked, mostly, until a woman in a ballroom had put her hand on his arm, and he'd realized, all at once, how much he'd missed wanting something he might actually lose. They didn't resolve everything on the porch that night. But something had cracked open that couldn't be closed again, and both of them knew it. 1 month later, an ordinary Thursday afternoon would put everything they'd just found back on the line. The ordinary Thursday arrived without warning, the way real crises usually do. Halvorson's largest client, Corrigan Freight, had scheduled a final walkthrough of the company's flagship logistics facility before signing the renewal. The $11 million contract Ames had used as a weapon weeks earlier, and 20 minutes before the client's executives arrived, the facility's backup climate control system failed catastrophically, threatening a warehouse full of temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical freight that Corrigan handled under strict contractual guarantees. The in-house facilities team, competent but unfamiliar with the aging industrial unit at the heart of the failure, could not isolate the fault fast enough. Natalie stood in the control room, watching a countdown to spoiled inventory and a client walkthrough colliding on the same afternoon, and made a decision she would have found unthinkable a year earlier. She called Travis. He arrived in 11 minutes, in his work clothes, without ceremony, and moved through the facility the way he'd once moved through industrial plants for a living, reading the system not as an outsider, but as someone who had spent a decade of his life fluent in exactly this kind of machinery. He identified the fault in under 3 minutes, a failed relay in the secondary compressor circuit, compounded by a bypass someone had wired incorrectly years earlier to save an afternoon's labor and never corrected. He explained it to the facilities manager in plain, specific terms, not vague reassurance, but the exact part number, the exact sequence of an emergency workaround that would hold the temperature for the 6 hours they needed, and had the system stabilized with 8 minutes to spare before Corrigan's executives walked through the door. They never knew how close the walkthrough had come to disaster. What they saw instead was a facility running smoothly, a CEO who was calm and precise under pressure, and, standing quietly near the control panel in work clothes, a man none of them recognized but whom the facilities manager kept glancing at with unmistakable respect. The contract was renewed that afternoon. Nobody outside the control room ever learned how close it had come to falling apart, which was, Travis would later say, exactly how he preferred it. Preston Ames learned a different version of the story soon enough, and not the one he wanted. Marisol, cross-referencing the maintenance logs from the near failure with the facility's original installation records, found something that had nothing to do with Travis and everything to do with Ames. The original bypass wiring, the one that had nearly cost the company its largest contract, had been authorized under a cost-cutting directive Ames himself had pushed through 6 years earlier, over the objections of the engineering team at the time. Objections that had been quietly buried in a memo Ames had asked to be removed from the official record. It was not fraud exactly. It was negligence dressed up as fiscal discipline, the kind of decision that looks reasonable in a spreadsheet and catastrophic on a warehouse floor. And it had been sitting there for 6 years, waiting for the wrong afternoon to surface. Natalie brought it to the full board the following week, not as an act of revenge, but as a matter of plain governance. The kind of thing any responsible CEO would be obligated to disclose. She did not need to argue Ames into a corner. The facts did that on their own. He resigned from the board within the month, citing personal reasons, and nobody in the room believed the phrase, and nobody needed to say so out loud. What mattered more to Travis than any of it was smaller, and happened 3 days after the Corrigan crisis, in Natalie's kitchen, where Chloe and Ruthie were doing homework at the counter, and Natalie was making the coffee neither of them really needed, the same as she had the very first time. She told him, without any of the careful distance of the past months, that watching him work that afternoon, precise, unhurried, entirely certain of himself, in a way he almost never let show, had clarified something for her she'd been circling for months. That the man people had mistaken for her partner at a gala 8 months earlier wasn't a mistake at all. It was, she said, the first accurate thing anyone in that ballroom had gotten right all night. Travis didn't have a polished answer for that. He never did. What he had instead was the truth, plainly stated, the way he said everything that mattered to him. That he'd spent a year telling himself the safest thing he could do for Chloe was to want as little as possible, so there'd be less to lose, and that Natalie and Ruthie had made that math impossible to believe in anymore. He told her he didn't want to keep being careful. He told her he wanted, if she'd let him, to stop being the man mistaken for her partner and become, honestly and on purpose, exactly that. Neither of the girls at the counter looked up from their homework. Both of them, it turned out later, had been listening the entire time, and neither was even slightly surprised. 2 months later, in front of the same board, the same donors, and the same ballroom where the story had begun, the company would gather again for its next great occasion. And this time, nobody would be left guessing about anything at all. The Halvorsen Foundation's spring gala was smaller than the winter one, quieter, held in the same ballroom but arranged differently. Round tables instead of standing crowds, a stage at the front instead of a roped-off dance floor. Natalie had insisted on the change herself, telling her events team she wanted an evening people could actually hear each other in. What none of the guests knew, filing in that April evening in their evening wear, was that they'd been invited to 2 separate occasions folded quietly into one: the annual fundraiser and, 20 minutes into it, a wedding. There was no grand entrance, no orchestrated reveal. Natalie had wanted it that way, and so had Travis. Neither of them had ever needed an audience to know what they meant to each other, and the ballroom full of witnesses was, if anything, simply the place where the truth finally caught up to what had already been true for months. When the moment came, Natalie stood at the front in a pale blue dress instead of a gown, Ruthie beside her holding a small bouquet with both hands like it might escape her, and Travis stood across from her in a suit that, this time, actually fit, Chloe standing just behind his shoulder in the exact spot her mother had once stood in family photographs. Except this time she was smiling like she'd been let in on the best secret of her whole life. Before the vows, the officiant, an old friend of Natalie's father, asked, as officiants sometimes do, whether anyone present had ever doubted this day would come. A ripple of quiet laughter went through the room, and somewhere near the back, near the same spot he'd once stood holding sparkling water and rehearsing a correction he never made, Travis caught Natalie's eye and knew they were both remembering the exact same night. Neither of them had corrected the room then. Neither of them needed to correct it now. The board had offered Natalie, in the weeks before the wedding, a public statement, a press release, a company-wide announcement framing the marriage as good news for morale, a gesture meant to formally close the chapter Ames had once tried to weaponize. Natalie declined it. She asked instead that Halvorsen quietly fund something smaller and less visible, a permanent line item in the company's community program, dedicated to emergency response training grants for tradespeople and maintenance workers across the city. The kind of unglamorous, overlooked expertise that had saved her daughter's life on an ordinary Tuesday and had never once, in the company's history, been publicly thanked for what it was worth. Travis hadn't asked for it. He hadn't wanted his name on it, and it wasn't put there. What mattered to him wasn't recognition. It was the plain fact that somewhere, some other quiet, competent person doing unglamorous work might get the training that let them do for a stranger's child what he'd once done for Ruthie. The quiet coda came weeks later, on an ordinary Saturday morning that looked like nothing at all. No gala, no boardroom, no crisis. Natalie stood at the kitchen counter of the house on the hill, which was, by then, simply the house, no longer hers alone, watching Travis fix a cabinet hinge that had been squeaking for exactly as long as she'd lived there, and that she had never once thought to have repaired. because it had never occurred to her that squeaking hinges were the kind of problem someone could just quietly solve. Chloe and Ruthie were in the next room, already arguing amiably about whose turn it was to pick the movie. The particular argument of two sisters who had stopped, months earlier, needing the word step in front of that title at all. Natalie asked Travis, watching him work, whether he ever thought about that first night at the gala, whether he regretted not correcting the room the moment it started. He thought about it for a moment before answering, the way he thought about everything. He told her that for a long time he'd believed the safest life was the smallest one, the one where nobody mistook you for anything you weren't, because nobody expected anything from you at all. But somewhere between a swimming pool and a warehouse control room and this kitchen, he'd learned that being underestimated wasn't actually safety. It was just a quieter kind of being unseen. And he said he was glad now that on one ordinary night in a ballroom full of strangers, someone had finally seen him correctly, even if it started as a mistake nobody bothered to fix. If there's someone in your own life like that, someone quietly overlooked, misjudged before anybody took the time to actually see who they were, this story was, in its own way, for them too. Some of the best things that happen to us start exactly this way, as a misunderstanding nobody corrected, because some part of us already suspected the truth was better than the assumption. Thanks for staying with this one until the end.